Okay, I think we're live.
All right. Welcome to the community budget forum, and I will turn this over to Meg.
Thank you. So I want to walk through where we stand with our budget development for next year at this point. It seems like different things pop up almost on a daily basis that we add or change with the budget. I'm hopeful that there won't be too many more changes, and this is close to the final draft, but there likely will be continued to be some tweaks between now and the time that the board adopts the budget in April.
Okay.
The current version of the budget has a budget total of $22,585,000. You'll see at the bottom that's so the two different sources of income are revenues that are going to fund the budget are revenues we anticipate for the year, which are currently budgeted at $21,745,000, and also appropriated fund balance of $915,000. Those two together make up the $22,585,000. This is more appropriated fund balance than we've appropriated in recent years, and we've been trying to wean the budget off of that. But we've identified sort of a one-time use of some additional fund balance that we'll talk about later in the presentation. And expenditures are also projected at $22,585,000. This is a 5% increase over this year's adopted budget, which was $21,549,412. But as we'll talk about in a few slides, the proposed tax, despite the fact that the overall budget is increasing 5%, the proposed tax levy increase is 0.65%. So we'll talk about that in a few slides in. This looks at the different sources of revenue that fund the district's budget and compares from the current year's budget to what's being projected for next year. You'll see that there's a $44,000 proposed increase in property taxes, which is, again, the 0.65% increase. State aid is projected to increase 1.55% based on the numbers that were in the governor's executive proposal back in January. Federal revenue, we have increasing from $100,000 to $500,000. This is primarily due to federal stimulus money that we're using to help fund next year's budget. And I've got a slide where we'll get into some more detail on that in a little bit. Other revenue, which are a lot of miscellaneous sources of revenue, everything from rental of music instruments, sale of surplus, interest earnings, all sorts of those things lumped together, a lot of smaller categories. And then again, the appropriated fund balance in this year's budget was $525,000, and we've currently gotten the budget $915,000 for next year. So again, this just adding here the percentage changes on each of those categories. This is just looking graphically at the same information where, what types of revenue make up what percent of our budget. You'll see that state aid makes up about 16% of our budget. Property taxes, 62% of our budget. Property taxes about 30%. Fund balance is a little, almost 4%. The federal revenue is 2%, and then the green slice is all those other little miscellaneous revenues. So clearly the bulk of the budget comes from state aid and property taxes. Just looking at state aid specifically for a moment, this chart shows you the different categories of state aid and what the current year budget is versus what we're projecting next year. Most all of them are flat or decreasing. The only ones that are increasing are the ones that are highlighted in yellow: BOCES aid, transportation aid, and building aid. And the only reason that these are increasing is because they're expense-driven aids. So the more we spend in those areas, the more aid we'll get. As we've done additional services and put additional things through BOCES, that's driving up our BOCES aid. Our transportation aid is increasing primarily because now we have additional leased buses that are being added in there. If you remember, this year we added our last group of leased buses. So as that lease expense is increased, our transportation aid increases. And building aid is increasing because of our capital outlay project. So this is next year will be the first year that we're seeing a return of that money that we put out in a capital outlay project in the form of building aid. So again, just to recap, state aid is increasing just slightly, and where it is increasing, it's a result of us spending more in those areas. Anybody have any questions? All righty. Property tax revenue that's included in the budget is $6,856,000. If we make the assumption that the taxable assessed value stays fairly constant, with what it was for this year's budget, the tax rate would be $12.90 per thousand. This year's rate was $12.82, so that's an 8-cent increase in the tax rate. So if there were a property assessed at $100,000, you would see about an $8 increase in the tax bill. There's a couple of things that are, affecting the amount that we've put in the budget. The allowable levy growth factor for this year was lower than the 2% that everyone talks about because the consumer price index was less. So the allowable levy growth factor was set at 1.23%. But there's other factors that go into the tax cap formula. And one of them is capital items that are in the district's budget that can be excluded from the tax cap. And what actually happened for us this year was that our capital exclusions went down. So that reduction in the capital exclusion offset the increase that we could increase. So that's how we ended up at 0.65% rather than the 1.23%. In addition, in the current draft of the budget, I've projected a decrease in pilot revenue. We have one entity in the village that is, their pilot is expiring. They have approached the town and the village and the school district about extending that pilot, but we don't currently know for sure whether or not that's going to happen. They were due to get all those entities some more information. I'm hopeful that while the extension may not be official by the time we adopt the budget, that all the entities will have received and reviewed the necessary information and will at least have a good indication whether or not that's going to be extended at that point in time. So again, it's a $44,000 increase in the tax levy, which is 0.65% from the current year. Any questions on that?
No.
Okay. Again, appropriated fund balance is the other source that we're using to help fund the budget for next year, and we're increasing at about $390,000. We've talked a lot about fund balance over the last couple of years. It's an area that we've looked at and try to manage well. Fund balance is not something that we want to use to fund, year to year ongoing expenditures, because then you run into a problem when that's gone and you no longer have that recurring source of revenue. We've identified a change that we're looking to make in the district's health insurance plan for next year. And I've got a slide with a lot more detail on it in a little bit, but basically it involves switching from our current traditional health insurance plan to a high deductible health plan, which includes some funding of HRAs and HSA to help fund those deductibles for the district's employees. And so it would take an initial investment to sort of get the HRAs up and running. And that's why we've increased the use of fund balance for year one of that program to help fund that initial investment in the HRAs. This slide, there's a lot going on. I had to remove all the extra color and stuff to get everything here, but this is just a look at our fund balance over the last several years. So as we know, the law limits us to fund balance being 4% of the next year's appropriations. And you can see here that we've exceeded that. Sorry. We've exceeded that over the last few years. We've been at more like 6 to 7% of the next year's fund balance. So we've done a few things to help manage our fund balance, including putting money in capital reserves. So if you look at this last column here, we started this year with a fund balance of about $2,650,000. I've done some projections of where I think we're going to end this year. And based on the changes we made in staffing, as well as just some expenditure constraints that we put on, as well as expenditures that just aren't happening because of COVID, like field trip expense and reduced athletic expense, things like that. I'm anticipating at this point that we might have roughly a $750,000 surplus at the end of the year. There's still some things in the works that could change that, and it obviously includes a lot of assumptions, but that's what I'm projecting at the moment. So that would give us an ending fund balance of about 3.4 million. And then we have here our restricted funds, which is funds that we've put into reserve. So you see that increased from 670 to 945. That's taking into account the funds that the board has approved to put into our 2 retirement reserves, as well as the increase in the property loss reserve. And then we have the fund balance that we'd be appropriating to next year. Assigned fund balance is some items that carry over from one year's budget to the next. So that would leave us with a projected ending fund balance of 1.5 million, which is still about 6.8% of the next year's budget. So I go through this to show that our fund balance that we're projecting for the end of the year would still be reasonable. It's still slightly high compared to what we're requested to have at the end of the year, or what New York State law says we can have at the end of the year. There is some discussion about increasing that to 6% for school districts, given the different financial challenges that they're anticipated over the next couple of years, but that has not yet been approved. I may also approach the board, depending on where the actual surplus comes out for the end of this year. As we get closer to the end of the year, I may approach the board about putting additional funds in the capital reserve in anticipation of the Townsend flooring project that is going to need to be done in the next couple of years. The goal would be to get funds built up in that reserve to again be able to fund the local share of that project without any increase in the tax levy. So if we're looking to do that project in the next year or two, and we can begin to put somewhere, in the neighborhood of $500,000 to $600,000 into the capital reserve over that time, we think we should be able to do that. I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, and I just threw a lot at you. Any questions on that?
I think
No
that's
questions. I think that's a good idea, though.
Yeah, I do too. I agree.
I mean, Dr. McDonald mentioned to you in the previous meeting, things like the paving and things like that. All of these things will affect, that final number, but I'll continue to watch it as we get close to the year. And what I'm thinking is that I may come to the board and ask for approval to put a maximum of X number of dollars into the capital reserve, and we can, I can tweak that final number depending on where the June 30 comes in. Okay.
Okay.
As I mentioned earlier, we've increased the amount of federal funding anticipated in next year's budget. We've appropriated $375,000 of funding that's coming to us in the form of the stimulus. Our current allocation is the $937,000. That's what we've been told for sure that we're getting. We don't have all the details about how that can be used, but we've kind of moved forward under the assumption that it can be used in the same way the CARES Act funding can be used. So we know that this funding is intended not just to cover 21, 22, but to span multiple fiscal years. So we didn't want to be using the whole $937,000 in one year. We have identified 5 teaching positions that if classes and schedules could be adjusted if we didn't have to accommodate COVID, and we may not still need all of those teaching positions if we could have larger class sizes and we didn't have as much distancing. So we've identified those positions. They remain in the budget. They will be funded by this stimulus funding. And at some point in the future, when COVID restrictions are not still in place and we're back to operating normally, we'll have to revisit those positions as far as funding available and the need for them at that time. That leaves us some additional of the stimulus funding to carry over to future years, should we still be in this situation in the following year or have other needs that arise. That wraps up the revenue side of things. I was going to take a minute and talk about the appropriation or expenditure side of things. Again, this chart just compares what's included in next year's draft budget to what's in the current year's budget. You'll see there's about a 2.8% increase in wages. While many individuals' wages are increasing per the union contracts by 3%, or in some cases a little bit more, because of positions we've eliminated, the net impact is less than that 3%. You'll see that the equipment budget is increased. This is due to, we put a line item in for $70,000. I know there's been some talk among the facilities committee about purchasing a piece of, like a tractor or a loader, a piece of equipment for the Operations Department. We've determined that that purchase will not be made this year. We'll be projecting to make that purchase next year. And we haven't yet narrowed down exactly what piece of equipment we're going to get. We're continuing those discussions and making sure it'll meet all our needs. But we wanted to be sure to include the purchase of it in the budget. The only other item that I'll point out here is benefits. You'll see there's a projected increase of 17%. So in this benefits, it includes FICA, unemployment, health insurance, dental insurance, vision insurance, all of those contributions to the retirement system, all those sorts of things. We've budgeted about a 20% increase in health insurance to accommodate the change to the new plan and the funding of the HRAs and HSAs, but netted out with total benefits, it's a 17% increase. I'll also note that we do have the $100,000 for another capital outlay project remaining in the budget as well. Again, this is just looking at it graphically. What percentage of the budget is makes up these different categories consist of, and we often talk about how salaries and benefits together account for about 70% of our budget. So really, most of the funding that we spend has to do with the people that do what we do. I was going to talk for a few minutes about the proposed change to our health insurance plan. The quote from Excelis and projected cost to renew our current plan for next year was at a 28% increase or $4.6 million. Excelis has provided costing for a high deductible health plan, which brings the increase down to 23% or $4.457 million. That's the complete cost, including both premium, full funding of the HSAs, and full funding of the HRAs. The high deductible health plan would include a $4,000 deductible for single plans and $8,000 for family plans. The district would provide the majority of the funding for the deductible through the HSA and the HRA. A very small contribution from the employee would be required. It's about 2% of the deductible. So for an individual, it's $70. For a family, it's $210. And the way that it's structured is the HSA would be used first. The HSA would be $1,400 for a single and $2,800 for a family. After that's used up, the individual or the family would have to contribute the $70 or the $210, and then they would have access to the HRA to fund the rest of the deductible. After the deductible is met, medical costs are covered 100%, and they would have co-pays for prescription costs up to the out-of-pocket maximum for the plan. So we're looking at an overall cost increase. The premium part of the cost is decreasing about 4%, but then the district will also be funding the HSA and HRA. One of the purposes of switching to this plan is to help drive, encourage our employees to be more consumer minded. The funds that are put into the HRA, if not used by the employee, roll over into an HSA that they can take with them in retirement or to be used for other services that are eligible for the HSA. So if they don't use that in a year, those funds become theirs. The HRA, if not fully utilized, that ends up being a savings to the district. So the budget assumes that our HSA would be used 100% because the district puts out that money either to fund the health costs or to put the money in the employee's account at the end of the year. And it assumes that the HRAs would be funded at 75%. We think that's a pretty conservative estimate based on the experience with similar groups that ENV has had. We have had some informational meetings with leadership in the district about this with ENV, just explaining it to them, talking about how it works. Tomorrow, we actually have 2 employee informational sessions that ENV is going to be hosting to provide information to the employees. It's a lot of information, and I know it's complicated, particularly when you're used to a traditional health plan. So I'll stop for a minute and feel free to ask any questions or clarification. Or Dr. McDonald, if you want to chime in on anything I may have skimmed over, please do.
Meg, just to clarify, they're to use the HSA first, and then it goes to the HRA.
after the small employee contribution in the middle.
Okay,
The HSA is first, and then their out-of-pocket funds, and then the HRA.
okay. And what was the out-of-pocket funds again? The amount?
$70 for a single, $210 for a family.
Okay, gotcha.
That 210 is maximum for the year, is that correct?
Until they got to everything else would be funded up to the $8,000 deductible. And then after that, they would have prescription copays.
Okay.
Okay. And the copay, is that a set copay or is that a percentage of the prescription?
I could look up the numbers, but it's hard for me to do both things, but it's like 5, 10, 35. Is that it, Dr. McDonald?
Okay. Yep.
I think it's 535.70.
Oh, I'm sorry, 535.70, based on whether it's generic, formulary, or preferred.
Okay. So that would be a number they would know going into it, knowing what the prescription is.
Yes.
And that's only after they hit the 8,000 threshold. To hit that threshold, that's where it comes into play. Before that, the cost comes out of the up to $8,000 cost. So then the prescription plan comes into play up until the maximum out of pocket. So, and the reason why the HSA, HRA, the frontline HSA is first, and then the out of pocket is again to encourage the consumerism. And then the district funded money comes last. So if somebody has a family of 20, it's $2,400 a year plus 210, and they only spend $1,800 a year, 600 plus the 210, the $600 HSA will roll over, and they'll never have any out of pocket for that year. So, but if somebody has the need, that's what the healthcare is there for, and the health insurance. If they have the need and they use $8,000, $9,000, and then they have additional prescriptions, they will have paid $210 out of their pocket, and then they'll pay the ongoing prescription costs up to their maximum out of pocket.
And just to clarify how an HSA works, the funds are put into this account, but they can only, especially once it's transferred to an employee, it can only be withdrawn for medical approved medical expenses, correct? Otherwise they pay a penalty?
It's for allowable medical expenses. They could use it to offset cost of dental or vision. However, if they do that, then they have less money for their medical.
Right.
So
Okay.
approved medical expenses, and it has it has the envelope of what it's able to be used for.
If they have funds that they take with them in the HSA when they retire, it can also be used for Medicare premiums.
Okay.
Hearing aids, different things, expenses that as a retiree you incur that would be handy to have that for.
It's very powerful because, as Meg has said, and on a number of occasions, that this stays with the individual. So if they were to, whether at retirement or if sever employment with the district and move, it is theirs, and they could continue. And if they have, even another medical plan somewhere else, then they don't have to touch it, and it can continue to grow, because it can be, some of these have options for investments and things like that. But I don't know the range of what this is, but I do think it is a nice opportunity for our employees to kind of own the cost of their health care.
So this is a program that realistically, if I'm reading this correctly, you have a new employee, let's say, starting out in their career with this plan, could really benefit them over a long run.
Yes.
Absolutely. So if you figure somebody comes in new, they're single, they have $1,400, they're healthy, and they spend $400 a year, that's $1,000 that will roll over, and then they do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again. That's $1,000, and it starts building up, and it's over here. And then let's say 8 years from then, they have a really terrible year in a high cost need. and they use up their HSA and they have additional expenses or needs or medical equipment or whatever the case may be within that window, they've got that on reserve. Let's say they don't need that, that just sits there and it builds. And so they have a family after that, and that goes up to 2,400. They have some real healthy years with their family, and then it just continues to compound. And all the while, as a district, we're benefiting from that experience rating and that ability from to have consumerisms. We're pushing telehealth. We're pushing going to your provider versus going to urgent care and ER, that type of consumerism, which really has a direct impact on our experience rating.
So it's definitely a win-win for the district and the employee.
Absolutely. Mutually beneficial.
So as I mentioned, the budget assumes that we spend 75% of all the HRA funds. So we kind of need two things to happen moving forward. We're hoping to drive consumerism and hopefully bring the costs of our plan down by our employees and their dependents being more conscientious consumers of the healthcare. And then, we're appropriating additional fund balance to help fund those HRAs initially. If we get to the end of the year and we find that we spend 50% of the HRA, we'd take the 25% extra in this year's budget, we'd roll it over and we'd have to add 25 to it. We can't be appropriating almost $400,000 of fund balance every year to fund these HRAs. So we really need to hopefully have good experience with the HRAs and have good improved plan experience as we move forward. So we're taking the funds that we have available to us at this time because of the different factors that affected this year to initiate this change to move forward.
While still looking each and every year as our experience rating hopefully stables out to other opportunities, whether they be self-funded, consortiums, whatever the case is. We won't stop looking as we look each year to try to get this stable for the community and for our district.
Good.
Okay. Some other expenditure changes. I know we've talked about this some. I just wanted to highlight some of the other changes that are in the budget. We've included a full-time social worker addition for the district. Initially, we had talked about doing this through BOCES, but really felt that it was a better fit and we would be able to maximize the services by having a full-time individual here. So we've included that in the budget. Last year, we had added to the budget $15,000 of classroom furniture. We've taken that out this year. We've also decreased the overtime budget for the O&M department, as well as some smaller decreases in overtime in some other departments. They don't have as significant overtime budgets, so it was kind of minor. There's the increase in equipment for the tractor loader that I mentioned earlier. The New York State ERS contribution rate is increasing, so that's reflected. We've made changes to our workman's compensation carrier effective 7/1, resulting in a reduced premium for that. We're moving our LRS service to BOCES, to a service through BOCES, which again will not drive additional BOCES aid next year, but it will the year after. We've made some other adjustments to BOCES services, added some things, decreased some things, adjusted some FTEs. So the net of all of those is reflected. We've included the reduction of one aide position through attrition. And again, this isn't a change, but I just wanted to again point out that we've maintained the $100,000 capital outlay project.
And we've also maintained the reduction that happened mid-year or in the fall of the director of curriculum instruction.
Yes.
And Meg, just for clarification, for the general public looking at this on YouTube, the LRS and the FTEs?
Sorry. Move labor relations service to BOCES. So that's an individual that works with the districts to help manage employee relation issues, union negotiations, different things like that. And then we have certain services through BOCES that are billed to us based on a full-time equivalent, how much that individual is here for full-time. So, if they're a 0.5 FTE, they'd be here 2.5 days a week or 2 days one week and 3 days the next week. So some of the services that we have through BOCES, like computer or public information, we've reduced the amount of time that that individual is in the district.
Thank you.
So we will continue to refine the budget estimates over the next couple of weeks. I'm hopeful that we will get a revised state aid run over the next few days as the state budget is finalized. There's been discussion that we may see an increase in foundation aid that was not in the executive budget proposal that we had. If we get that, that's wonderful, and I'll factor that in. If we do get additional foundation aid, my first thing to do with that is going to give us a little more breathing room in some of the expenditure areas where the budgets I think are really tight. And then if that increase allows us to make other adjustments too, my next plan of attack would be to decrease the amount of appropriated fund balance. We've made some assumptions about what our federal grants will be next year and what staff we can allocate to those grants. We don't have those final estimates, and we won't before we adopt the budget. So that's just an area that we might have to adjust for later on in the year. And we may have things, we seem to have things changing on pretty much a daily basis with special education and the different services that students need, particularly as those plans for next year are being worked on now. So if there's any changes there, we'll make those as well. And then items that were talked about like tonight, strategic planning, if that's something the board decides to move forward with, we'll work to get that in the budget as well. So prior to the meeting on April 20th, I will provide the board with a final version and any updates on what's been changed. And we do a public presentation regarding the final budget that was adopted by the board on May 4th, and the budget vote is scheduled for May 18th.
Thank you. That was
Sounds
very
good.
thorough. I really
Welcome.
appreciate that. Thank you very much.
No problem. That's all I had.
All right.
All right. I don't hear any questions. Did anybody? I can't see anybody other than your screen.
Oh, I can stop that. Right.
So if there's,
No, thank you very much, Meg. As Rhonda said, that was very thorough. I appreciate it.
Welcome.
right. So as of right now, the general public can go on the website to watch this. And then if they have questions, like we said, they can contact the district clerk or by email in the BOE. And the survey is on there as well, correct? They'll have a link to that.
Correct. Underneath the budget section of the website is the budget forum comment form.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Again, thank you for all that hard work that you compiled all that and did all those screens. I really appreciate it. It was very thorough.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
All right. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.